So maybe you noticed that the title of my talk is inspired from the famous paper from Tansley. Maybe you know this paper. This is the paper in which he criticized Clement's position, Clement's metaphor about associations as organisms. So this is why I chose this title. Okay, should we fall in love with our models and metaphors? Literally or not? So there's a couple of famous quotes about that. This one, maybe this one as well, and maybe the most famous is this one. And yeah, I will talk about this kind of issues in this talk. And let's choose an example outside ecology. So maybe one of the most important metaphors in biology, at least during the last 50 years, is the informatic program which is used for the development of organisms. So the metaphor has been used since the 60s. This is Ernst Mayer's famous paper dealing with a lot of topics in the philosophy of biology. Maybe this paper is one of the first papers about an autonomous philosophy for biology. And there's a lot of interesting stuff in it, including this questionable metaphors, which has had a lot of implications on how we conduct research on the development of organisms. And I think this is really a problematic metaphor, so that's not the topic of today, but just to illustrate that maybe there are similar metaphors used in ecology which we should question a little bit in order to do better science. And of course, this metaphor has been criticized since the beginning, but it is still operating nowadays, maybe not in scientific practice, or maybe yes, but at least it is still used in just the way biologists teach to young people and stuff like that. It's a very common misleading way to present the development of organisms. Well, anyway, that's another topic. So I will use the word metaphor in a very broad sense. Mathieu this morning talked about how to translate from model to ecology. So maybe the word translate was maybe the way you use the word I chose here is metaphor. So any comparison between everyday life and ecological processes, any word employed both in everyday life and in ecological research, this can be the start of many confusions. And any preconception, conscient or not, of how ecological processes are conceived. And I will focus, that's a choice, on two processes, ecological stability and ecological functions. I also considered talking about ecological objects instead of processes. So the main object, obviously, is ecosystems, but that would have been way too long, so we will focus only on stability and functions. So the aims are to show how deep metaphor, what I mean by deep metaphor is that something which is sometimes unnoticed, but in fact very important and with a lot of consequences, how they can be misleading. And to illustrate this echoes Mathieu's talk this morning, how models and metaphor can interact. Well, there are other aims which we will also encounter. So to show that theoretical ecology is not only about mass, but that you already mentioned this morning. And also we will probably learn some stuff about stability and functions. And in fact, the talk could have been entitled How to Conceive Stability and Functions in Ecology. So if the use of models and metaphor is a bit obscure to you, just focus on those two concepts, and so we will try to understand them a bit more in an ecological concept. Okay, so that's the outline. And we will begin with the idea of balance of nature. So that's an extremely old idea. So more than 2000 ago, we can find some writings mentioning this idea. Okay, so can you read from? Yeah, it's not too small. Okay. And of course, the idea of the balance of nature at that time was thought to be the product of a divine entity, and this has not changed for a long time. So with Linnaeus, we find the same kind of idea. Okay, so that's interesting concerning Linnaeus because he's well known for the binomial classification system. He's also well known to be a creationist concerning the origin of species, but as you can notice, he was also concerned by what we could call nowadays ecological questions. So he was not only doing systematics. Okay, but at the beginning of the development of ecology as a science, people started to criticize the idea of the balance of nature. So so the Broken Balance is the name of a book concerning the dynamics of the wolves in Île Royale. It's the border between the US and Canada. I will talk about that in details afterwards. But well, that's quite recent, but a long time ago, almost 100 years ago, the famous ecologist Charles Elton just said that, well, okay, let's throw the idea to the rubbish. It just doesn't exist because population numbers fluctuate a lot. And I will exemplify this idea using what happened on Île Royale. So that's a small island in the middle of a lake. I don't remember the lake. Maybe people coming from there know the Lake Superior. Okay, thank you. And then moose came first in this island at the beginning of the 20th century, and then wolves arrived by crossing an ice bridge. And when people started to count population numbers, well, they thought that they were inspired by the idea of the balance of nature. So they thought, okay, probably population numbers will reach a stable equilibrium, and wolves will help maintaining a constant number of moose, and nature will do nice things. That was the idea of the people at that time. And indeed, during the maybe 5 or 10 years, the first 10 years of the recording, they could observe such a balance of nature, but of course then things became much more different. First, the wolf population crashed because of a disease. And then the moose population collapsed because of a severe winter and also because of ticks. I guess not because of the ticks themselves, but probably because of the disease they injected to the moose.
Sometimes they can, in Quebec for instance, they have way too many ticks.
Okay.
Like on deers, they can die.
Okay.
I don't know for moose. Yes.
Well, probably. And then the wolf population increased a little bit because before that they suffered from inbreeding depression, but a new wolf arrived. So we can see that the population numbers fluctuate a lot, and not because of internal dynamics of a prey-predator system, that's funny, but because of events that arrive. And so that's just an example of a broken ecological balance. So that's the data, but at the same time, 100 years ago, as you know, people started to develop models about ecological equilibrium.
Quick question.
Yeah.
Can you go back to the moose and wolf slide?
Yeah.
I mean, couldn't you make the argument that the system is kind of balancing itself? On one hand, the wolves swing up, and then they come back down, and the moose.
Yeah, this is what I mentioned. If you don't know all that, you may think that it's a classical Lotka-Volterra system. But then when you know that, in fact, it's just because the fluctuations are due to external perturbations.
Okay.
What do you mean? You could argue that there's been such an epidemic because there's other wolves. So it's kind of like density regulation, which would be kind of be part of your carrying capacity in some ways.
Okay.
I don't mind.
No, but in fact, I'm glad with these questions because somehow it demonstrates that we really want to see balance in nature. Because when we face such a chaotic dynamic, we try to see, okay, maybe we can fit that into a balanced model afterwards. And maybe you're right, I don't know. But that's a tendency we have. What?
When do you decide that the system is balanced or not balanced? Because if I zoom out, the densities they are changing about 3 times.
Yeah. Well, personally, I don't decide anything. But the people working there, as far as I understood, at the beginning they thought, okay, this is balanced, and then someone said, well, let's continue observing the population stability, and so they thought that this was balanced, and then they observed that. So obviously, compared to this situation, this is not balanced. Maybe from another point of view, this is balanced, but when we see that this overall balance, for sure there is no population crash. But maybe there will be one day a population crash, because when we see that the fluctuations are really big and depend on special events, maybe one day a special event will provoke the collapse of the system, until a new population is founded by migration. Okay? So, if we turn to the famous Lotka, so he was quite wise concerning his own models. So, okay, as you all know, his equations predicted oscillations of the type we saw before, but except that before the fluctuations were probably caused by something else than the internal dynamics of the system. And so therefore his equations do not predict any extermination of the prey by the predator, but he was aware that the prey population might be reduced to very low levels and then might be driven to extinction by factors not included in the model, for example a disease or anything else. So he was not like kind of religious about his models. He just said, okay, I developed mathematical models, simplified, many other factors might cause the extinction of the prey or of the predator. So. Okay. But at the same time, in other instances, the models are interpreted differently. So let's see an example with the famous Ali effect model. So if you like equations, that's the only one of the whole talk. So and there are 3 equilibria, 2 of which are stable. And then, okay, so that's the mathematical analysis, and up to now there is no problem. Then the problem comes, as said Mathieu earlier, when you try to translate. On which equilibrium do we naturally tend to focus? Well, which one is considered as the natural one? Well, I think obviously the stable one, because we want a positive population number, we want something stable, and this is when this is where the problem comes. That there is a kind of conflation between the mathematical modeling, which tries to find equilibria, and the old idea of the balance of nature. And when these two ideas meet, then we will naturally focus on only one of the different equilibrium, because we just think they are good equilibrium and interesting equilibrium, but in fact the math is agnostic about that. So there has been a conceptual shift between the idea of a balance of nature with a constant population size, and after mathematical modeling, the shift has moved to the idea of fluctuations around a stable positive equilibrium. So some have argued that the balance of nature is a counterproductive metaphor, because it entails a static view of nature, whereas the equilibrium modeling approach, from a technical point of view, does not entail such a static view. And then probably the understanding of the theory, of the mathematical theory, has been impeded by its association with the metaphor, as we could see concerning the simple model of the Ali effect. And so there's a kind of value loading to the equilibrium concept. A positive value is associated to this notion, in the sense that a stable population equilibrium, a positive equilibrium, I should have added, is a desirable and natural state. So, and this is exactly what Mathieu said this morning. The problem lies in the interpretation of the model and not in the model itself. So maybe theoreticians might feel comfortable without that, because theoreticians are doing things okay, but then other ecologists are misinterpreting the results of the theoreticians. But sometimes I guess the theoreticians are also doing this mistake. Let's be modest. Okay, so far we have seen how stability is conceived, and we've noted that there is a problem concerning the conflation between the notion of balance and the notion of equilibrium. Let's now move to another question, which is why are ecological systems stable? So what is the origin of stability? Well, personally, I was extremely surprised to see that this is a very old question. It seems quite modern. Maybe the last 20 years, this question has become very popular. But in fact, it's almost 150 years old, at least as far as I could find in the literature. So that's a paper from Tensley. So in this paper, he also criticized Clement's views, as in Gleason's paper I mentioned earlier. But this paper is much richer than that, than just criticizing Clemens. So as you can see, he introduces the notion of natural selection between systems and not between organisms, as it is traditionally conceived. And this idea can also be found during the 19th century, so that was almost 150 years ago, in a fantastic paper. Maybe you've already seen this paper. So there is a community of interest. That's an idea which is also found in the literature about multi-level selection nowadays. And so according to Forbes, the organisms in the lake are selected to favor this community of interests. Of course, this idea of system-level selection promoting stability of the ecosystem has been heavily criticized from the beginning. So we've met Elton already, and here he comes again. And why does he think that natural selection at the system level is questionable? Well, because it will require the existence of competition between similar systems, which, according to him, is obviously not the case in nature. And I was extremely surprised to see that this kind of debate and I mean the ideas employed at that time are really similar to what we can find in nowadays literature. Okay, so maybe system level selection is not an option. We will see later. And there is another idea explaining the stability of the systems, is the idea of species level selection. It's, as you will see, there is a slight difference between both ideas. So again, that's the paper of Forbes, but as far as I could understand, there is a slight difference between this quote and the previous one. So there's a comparison with human affairs, which is quite common at that time. And as you see, that time he is not mentioning competition between systems, but the idea that an animal which is well adjusted to his own system will be selected positively. In other words, it's in the interest not in the whole system, but in the interest of every individual species to facilitate the overall stability. So in that case, species are selected for their own interests to promote stability, and so the promotion of stability at the system level is a byproduct of species level selection. So the idea of byproduct will emerge as well later on. And we can also find this idea in Ali, so Ali is the same one we met for the model. That's a collaborative work with other people like Emerson as well. So that was a very important book at that time, like a textbook of the time. And that's quite funny because he himself uses the idea of balance of nature. So again, with Ali, individuals are selected to fit with the balance of nature of the ecosystem they are part of. Okay, so maybe you noticed that this kind of argument corresponds exactly to the idea of group selection. And of course, group selection has been heavily criticized during the second part of the 20th century. This topic itself has a long history, and it has been suggested quite a couple of times that some mechanisms might evolve for the good of the species, as Lawrence proposed. So, for instance, the evolution of dispersal in order to avoid overcrowding, that was the idea of Vine-Edwards. So that's just a mistake, and there is a single Vine-Edwards. And concerning Lawrence, the evolution of ritualized fighting behavior. But of course, as you might know, group selection has been discarded in the 60s, following, for instance, the paper of Maynard Smith and there was another author, I don't remember. In this paper, they explained that they developed a model for the evolution of fighting behavior precisely to criticize the idea which had been proposed by Lawrence, and also the famous book by George Williams, Adaptation and Natural Selection. A critique, and what he means in critique is precisely against the ideas of for the good of the species. So, of course, this criticism against group selection also holds for the mechanisms we have just met before. So, for instance, that predators should refrain from overexploiting their prey in order to fit with the balance of nature. So, of course, this hypothesis also faces the problems related to group selection. But nowadays, there's been a lot of research on this topic, and group selection has been revitalized. So, concerning prudent predation, there's a couple of recent papers about that, starting from the beginning of the 20th century, and that's a recent one, but there are other ones a bit older. Okay, so there is a problem with system level selection, there is a problem with species level selection, although there is current ongoing research on that topic. So what is the alternative to explain the stability of ecological systems? Well, maybe it's an ecological byproduct, and not an evolutionary byproduct as I mentioned for species level selection. In that case, an ecological byproduct. And that was the hypothesis of Elton. So here it is. So as you can see, he tries to understand why animals do not go extinct, and he says, okay, maybe this is because predators will switch when preys become very rare, when a given species becomes rare, well, he switches to another one. So in that case, the stability of population numbers is a byproduct of the optimal foraging behavior of predators. So in that case, using this idea, predators are not selected to maintain their prey alive. They're just selected to forage optimally, and that's why prey do not go extinct. So this hypothesis concerns only a few species, but he also has in mind a whole ecological system. So that's a picture of one of the ecosystems he studied. And he describes a food cycle among all these compartments, and he contends that the stability of the food cycle, as you can see, a good arrangement for the regulating the number of animals, is just a logical consequence, let's say a natural consequence of the whole functioning of the food cycle. So this reminds me in liberal economic theory, the nature's invisible hand. Every species just seeks its own interest, and magically the system becomes stable. So maybe when I see this hypothesis, I feel quite convinced. But then when I see how Elton scales up his hypothesis to a whole system, I feel that we are back to the idea of the balance of nature.
Yes, it's like it incorporates dynamic. For example, I don't think this is exclusive from the first system and its level selection. What I think it incorporates is the dynamical aspect of the system.
Yeah.
Because you can change, but also the nature selection at the level of the system or species can operate.
But in that context, he doesn't suppose that there are several systems competing with each other and that the most stable one is selected. That's not what he says. He just said that there is a single system and its own functioning naturally leads to stability. Or at least not necessarily to fixed population numbers, but at least not to the extinction of important species or compartments.
Okay, but for example, the system level selection doesn't incorporate the dynamic of the system. The predator always predates the same prey.
Well, in
the races.
Yeah, the first hypothesis concerning this system selection mechanism, yeah, they did not include such details, of course. But present work can do that. I will present you a few examples about system level selection in modern theory. Okay, so let's turn to ecological function, and we will again meet the idea of system level selection, but in another context.
So, quick question. I think I'm just kind of curious, is a lot of the examples you give, they're very organismal focused, and I'm just wondering when it comes to the stability, why there hasn't been a history of including the environmental conditions that would support one food web versus a change to another. Like even in the last example of the Arctic, you don't see any really detail about whether the climate is super stable or not.
Yeah.
You don't see anything about availability of ice and weather, and I just feel like when I've looked in the literature, it seems like in the theoretical realm it's not talked about a lot.
So you mean the abiotic compartment is missing?
Yeah, the A-vowel
Yeah.
stuff.
Yeah. Well, at that time, the concept of ecosystem was very young. When they included precisely the abiotic compartment to the system. During the birth of animal ecology, they didn't include that much. But there is a small abiotic compartment here. But in later research, it becomes more important. That's the work of Lindemann and Autumn brothers, and in the future, in the recent works I will share with you, the abiotic compartment is an important part of the system. Okay, so now let's turn to functions, and in a way stability can be understood as a function as well. So just function can be understood as a generalized property of ecosystems, including stability itself. And the other functions will determine or not the stability of the system. Okay. In everyday words, there are several different notions about functions. First, the design function. So why a given object was created. So here's an example with an armchair. Okay, the problem with this armchair is that since the king, so that's this, in case you don't know French history, this one was beheaded during the French Revolution 250 years ago. So obviously the chair does not fulfill its design function anymore, but maybe nowadays there is a use function, so what it is used for. So maybe in a museum this chair might be used to block the doorway. I didn't invent this metaphor myself, I just took it in this paper. But maybe, in fact, someone wanted to block the doorway with that chair, but maybe this might not work, and the door maybe is not blocked at all. But there is also another related notion, which is a service function, what it serves. And maybe this chair is very famous and it attracts a lot of visitors to the place, but nobody wanted to use it that way, but it's just a function it acquired during its history. So, and this service function is actually the only thing that chair really does, because the doorway is not blocked and the king is not seated. Okay, so we can try to keep this idea in mind for the following. Okay, and in biology we mostly deal with design functions. So this can be formalized this way. So the function of x is dead means that x is there because it does the z. So because induces the idea of a design, and then z is a consequence of x being there. And that's the main understanding of function by evolutionary theory, of course. So the Darwinian revolution, as you know, replaced natural theology, like authors like William Paley and so on. They also had the same kind of idea concerning functions, that God had given specific attributes to species so that they could they could match their environments. That was the way the natural theologist conceived the species traits. And the Darwinian theory sees that exactly in the same way concerning the notion of function, except that they replaced a divine mechanism, a divine wisdom by a specific mechanism, which is natural selection. So both views, theological or evolution by natural selection, both views are in accord with the idea of design functions. And I think that ecology faces a similar challenge as the Darwinian revolution was facing in the middle of the 19th century, is to replace the idea of balance of nature by a mechanism as well, but this time a natural mechanism. And the question is, can it also be evolution by natural selection, as we already mentioned earlier, or is it something else? Or is it both? We'll see. Okay, so can we find designed ecological functions in ecological systems? Well, this would require ecosystem level selection. But as we already understood earlier, current evolutionary theory rejects this claim because since the 60s, the levels of selection above the organismic level have been criticized because ecosystems exhibit a low degree of part-whole integration, and because that is, if you remember, this is Elton's argument, because ecosystems do not form populations, so they cannot compete with each other during the process of natural selection. Okay, but since the 90s, the idea of higher level of selection has been rehabilitated. So, for instance, there is this nice paper about that. Ecosystem level selection is a conceptual and experimental possibility. So I've been working about, I've thought about that for a while. And there are also experiments of artificial ecosystem level selection. Here is an example, but there's another one as well, which is more recent. Okay, so maybe we can find design functions in ecological settings. And so we will turn to that point more specifically later on. But obviously, the idea of design functions in ecology is in contradiction with the way ecological research generally uses the word function. So let's understand this a bit more.
Just a question.
Yeah.
Could you go back to the?
Yeah.
So could you explain what does ecosystem typically do not for populations?
Yeah. You mean okay. Well. The theory of evolution by natural selection rests on the idea of Darwinian individuals, which traditionally correspond to organisms. So organisms form population. Organisms are selected inside populations, and populations evolve. Okay. But if we generalize the idea of evolution by natural selection, we can just say that, okay, we have Darwinian individuals, whatever their level in the biological hierarchy. And for instance, if we consider that our Darwinian individual is an ecosystem, then we need a population of similar ecosystems. Okay? Otherwise, if we have a single ecosystem, there is no selection possible. Okay. it's just a generalization of the very basic Darwinian mechanism. There's a nice paper by Richard Lewontin called The Units of Selection in 1970, which gives an abstract formulation of evolution by natural selection. Okay, so in this paragraph, we'll see that the way ecological research uses the word function does not really match with the idea of a design function. So maybe design function exists in ecology, but another question is how do we currently use this idea of function? Do I have time? Ça va? Ouais? Okay. 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 So, in particular, how does the biodiversity ecosystem functioning research program conceive functions? Well, within that context, generally species fulfill functions that are not given and fixed. They depend on the context into which the species are placed. They depend on the ecological context. They depend on the ecosystem in which the species occur. Maybe in a given ecosystem, species A will fulfill a given function, and in another ecosystem, the same species will have another function. Or similarly, relationally based, that is, it depends on the interactions the given species has with its ecological environment. So, this is something I imagine myself. Imagine an organism whose heart, in fact, functions not as a heart but as a kidney. So clearly, within the context of organisms, this does not happen. Well, in some contexts, this can happen in ecosystems. So, with this simple comparison, we can notice that the use of the word function in ecology is not the same as for organisms. For instance, traits that are evolutionary byproducts can have ecological functions. Decomposers have not been selected to recycle nitrogen. They have been selected to be able to eat pieces of leaves or to eat the fungi which grow on the pieces of leaves and so on. But nobody has selected them to play a role in the overall cycle. Well, at least that can be questionable, but at least that's the way evolutionists currently understand the traits of, let's say, decomposers. They are able to deal with dead organic matter for their own benefit, not for the benefits of the whole ecosystem. But nevertheless, ecologists attribute to decomposers a function which is very different from just being able to consume dead organic matter. Ecologists attribute to decomposer a function which has a meaning in the whole ecosystem, not just in the very life of the decomposer. So this conflicts with the idea of design functions. So for instance, I think that the question, why does species X or trait X fulfill a function F in an ecosystem? Why? I think this is not a very meaningful question for ecologists. Because the answer is just, well, because it's there and that's all. That's all. Nobody placed this species intentionally and telling to it you will fulfill this function, and that's your role. Well, later on I will revisit this idea, but at least that's, I think, the current way we conceive ecological functions. And so these ideas have been in particular developed by this paper, which I think is really fascinating. Okay. So maybe we can define another way to understand functions in ecology. So here is a proposition in this paper, which is inspired by another author, whose name is Cummins. So X can be a species or a set of traits. That's the ecosystem, that's the function. And as you can notice, there is absolutely no reference to the origin of the function. It just happens because X is there, and that's all. So this one has not been defined yet. C is related to classical ecosystem processes, productivity, energy flow, nutrient cycle. And this formulation does not explain why X is there. And that's precisely the point. There is no why question in the context of ecology compared to evolution. So for instance, so that's taken from the same paper. So fungi have the function of decomposing dead organic matter. If they are able to decompose woody products, and if this decomposition activity plays a role in the matter cycle of the ecosystem. Yeah.
My question about the difference between functions and roles. So we often hear roles are related, and is there in the role of the species the idea is like part of the role and designed to contribute to something?
Well, in the context of this presentation, for me it's equivalent, but maybe we should dig a bit more on that question. I don't know.
I would guess that this kind of function that Seb is talking about now is more like a role, and the other one is more the kind of thing that people used to call purpose or something like this. You know, like what it was designed for.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, purpose is a design function. And here we are talking about ecological functions. Yeah. I'm not sure I remember well, but I think in Darwin's book there is he employs the word role. I think so. I will check and tell you later. And of course, the meaning is a bit different because that was a very long time ago. But okay, so let's have an example. So as I told you, I'm quite a fan of this kind of plants, as well as Kevin. So we can use the use and service functions notions we met earlier. So for instance, sprinters are used by prey, are used by mites, and so their use function is to be a prey. Okay. And there's also a service function that sprinters fulfill. They serve as matter recyclers. So you see the metaphor used here, the use function of the chair was to block the door, because someone has decided to take the chair and use it in a particular purpose. So that's what mites do. They take a sprinter and they use it as food. And the service function of the chair was to attract people, but nobody had thought that the chair might be used that way. So that was not intentionally, and this is what happens for matter recycling. Nobody uses printers to recycle matter, this is just what they happen to do.
But the difference between use and serve function seems to be a difference of agency.
Agency?
Like somebody is like decides to do something.
Yeah, that's it.
And not all organisms have agency, right?
Well, mites, I agree with you that mites are not conscious of using springtail as food, but they use it anyway. There is an action, a concrete action. Well, I agree that the distinction between both types of function can be a little bit tricky. I think the most important distinction is between these two categories and the design function. So I think in that case it's much more clear. But I think nevertheless that there is something interesting between these two types of function.
I can bounce on that. If the ecosystem was an agent, then maybe matter recycling would be a useful term too.
Yeah, yeah, but it's not. So that's why we might need two related concepts. Okay. Okay, so now we will try to understand if we can find, nevertheless, design functions in ecology. Okay, we are aware that this is not the way ecological research understand this concept of function, because most of it is understood in a non-design way. But nevertheless, design function might exist after all, okay? Despite all the problems related to multi-level selection. Okay? J'ai été clair là? And I will use the example of niche construction to illustrate this idea. Well, I don't work on sphagnum species, but I think it's a fascinating model. So there's quite a lot of diversity in the sphagnum species, and some of them dwell in hollows, so at the water table level. So as you can see, this species is full with water. And others are way above the water table, so prefer drier environments. Okay. And in that study, they found a relationship between their height above the water table. So here, these species are hummock species, and here these are hollow species. And they found that there is a negative correlation between the height and the decay constant. So this means that maybe this decay constant evolved in order to allow the sphagnum species to be at the right height above the water table. Because those ones, they decompose quickly, so the peat does not accumulate too fast, and those ones decompose slowly, so the peat accumulates and they are higher above the water table. Okay. So, well, the authors propose to interpret this data as evidence for a niche construction ability. So in that case, that's a design function. The sphagnum species construct an environment which is beneficial to themselves. And in doing that, there is a byproduct, because they also build an environment beneficial to a whole community of organisms which may have some particular ecological preferences, drier or wetter environments, for instance. So I guess, I know nothing about water bears, but I guess that some water bears might prefer being lower in the water tables and others higher, for sure. Maybe not water bears, but in that case other organisms, I don't know, nematodes and whatever. Okay. So, concerning the sphagnum itself, that's a design function, and it has several fortuitous consequences for other organisms. Okay, but the problem with this kind of hypothesis is, as always, the same. So the tragedy of the commons, in case you don't know this metaphor, what happens if, so suppose that it's costly to adjust its decay constant to the needs of the species. In that case, imagine a species which is not willing to pay the cost of niche construction, but nevertheless benefits from the presence of neighbors which pay the cost of niche construction. So in that case, how can niche construction evolve? So we will try to answer this problem a bit later. Okay, if we have the idea of niche construction in mind, then in the case of caution species, there is also a design function where the plant builds its own soil for its own benefit. Because on the cliffs they live in, there is no soil, but inside the plant we can find some soil, which is the product of the plant itself. Okay.
The use function is always a consequence, or there is no selection?
No.
It's
Selection is
product of the
selection is only here,
okay.
and then no.
Okay.
But as I mentioned earlier, some design functions can have fortuitous consequences. This is the case here. But we cannot say that the sphagnum has been selected to construct environments beneficial to water bears. They just happen to be used by water bears, but they have not been selected for that purpose.
Okay.
Actually, I don't know if it feels to me that the decay constant is not entirely selected by the sphagnum species as well. It's a product of the environment, right?
Yeah.
By microorganisms.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, I was planning to talk about that a bit later, but indeed, that's not really a property of the organism, but of the whole ecosystem. In the context of this particular paper, they used the same environment for everybody, all the species involved. So in that case, the differences between species are attributable to the species properties and not to differences in the environments. But in nature, there are also differences in the environment, given that they don't live at the same level, of course. Yeah, we can keep this idea in mind. At what level is the property? Is it a property specific to an organismic level or to a higher level? Because in the level of selection problem, it's an important information. At what level is the property we consider? Okay. So, well, this is what I mentioned already. If niche constructing traits are costly. And if individuals can benefit from the niche constructing activities of their neighbors, then there is a problem related to the tragedy of the commons. And that's the same problem for the evolution of altruism, for the evolution of prudent predation, as we mentioned earlier, and so on. That's the problem of evolutionary cheating, call it whatever you like. Okay, but how can this problem be circumvented? Well, using the idea of space, of localized interaction. So that's always the same problem. The level of selection debate is intriguing because it's a very difficult debate. It has lasted for dozens of years, but curiously, it's very simple in reality because there is always the same problem, which is the tragedy of the common, and it's always the same solution: a localized interaction, spatial effects. Because if neighbors have similar phenotypes, for example, via limited dispersal, then the tragedy of the commons can be circumvented. So, for instance, concerning the evolution of altruism, there's a lot of papers using this idea, based on explicit models like cellular automata and stuff like that. Okay, so I will give you an example of a model trying to explore the ability, the evolution of niche construction ability by species, having in mind the problem of the tragedy of the commons. So this is something we've done with Jeff and other colleagues some time ago. Okay, so this morning Mathieu recommended to build simple models. So this is what we've done here, very simple model. Well, whatever the details of the model, but the idea is to try to understand how tannin production by plants can evolve. Okay, so the traditional explanation for tannin production is to act as anti-herbivore defense, and maybe that's one of the main reasons for the evolution of tannin production. Okay. Il faut brancher là. Il faut toucher des câbles. Ouais. Mais on n'a pas le droit de toucher des câbles.
C'est de la batterie, ça?
Oui, il faut le brancher.
Il n'est pas branché.
PC, ah,
Il faut toucher là. Ouais.
interesting. Là, you saw nothing.
Yeah. Merci. Okay. But tannins have other consequences than just deterring herbivores. They also have afterlife consequences, which consist in slowing down the nitrogen cycle by complexing proteins into tannin protein aggregates. So maybe if the ecosystem is limited in nitrogen, maybe plants can benefit from the production of tannins, because if tannins are complex, if proteins are complex by tannins, there will be then the nitrogen present inside the proteins will be less prone to leaking. So nitrogen will be kept inside the same ecosystem, and plants will be able to use this recalcitrant form of nitrogen thanks to the presence of mycorrhizae. Okay. So based on this idea, we built a model where plants have a biomass divided in two compartments, tannins and effective biomass. And then they produce two types of, in the soil, there are two types of nitrogen pools, one which is labile, which is not complex by tannins, and the labile compartment is prone to leaking, and another compartment of nitrogen which is recalcitrant because of the presence of tannins. And then plants can well absorb nitrogen either directly through the labile compartment or thanks to fungi associated with their roots, and those fungi are able to use the recalcitrant nitrogen compartment. Okay. Whatever the details, the idea is that producing tannins is costly in terms of carbon and therefore in terms of energy. So if a plant is producing tannin, it will create a recalcitrant pool in its surroundings, and this will benefit this plant because it will reduce losses via leaking. But then comes the tragedy of the commons. A neighboring plant which is not producing tannins might nevertheless be able to benefit from the presence of this enriched soil. But if we build a model which is spatial, so here space is only in one dimension, but that's way enough. Then neighboring plants have similar phenotypes due to limited dispersal. And then, so tannin-less plants, which are initially they correspond to the initial condition of the models, they become step after step invaded by tannin-producing plants, which create this recalcitrant pool of nitrogen. So if we consider space, the answer, the summary of all that is that yes, niche construction can evolve thanks to spatial effects. Okay. If we go back a little bit, recall the discussion we had concerning system level selection and group selection concerning stability. Okay. In the case discussed earlier concerning tannins, what is the level of selection involved? Is selection acting on a group of tannin producing plants? So in that case it would be group selection. Or on the local ecosystem formed by these plants, and this local ecosystem is characterized by slow matter cycling. In this particular case, maybe it's a bit hard to answer to that question, but I will give you afterwards another example where I think things are a bit more clear. So the question is selection discriminating a property at the group level or at the ecosystem level? So this meets Kevin's question earlier concerning the decay constant. Is it a property of the organism or of the ecosystem? So in the case of the decay constant, the answer is clearly yes, it's a property of the ecosystem. Okay, so I will give you an example to illustrate this kind of question with the evolution of mutualistic interactions. So mutualistic interaction involves two species. So we can speak about a mutualistic interaction if both species are mutualists. And so the mutualistic interaction is an emergent property of the system involving both species. We cannot say that one species has a mutualistic interaction. Of course not, we need two species for that. Okay. So in that case, I think the question is more clear, because we will focus on a property at the community level. In that case, it's a very simple community formed by only 2 species. So this was done by Léo Ledru. Many people here know him. He was a PhD student working with me and other colleagues a few years ago. And here is there's also some maths behind that, but I will focus only on this picture. So that's the state of the system before the evolution of mutualistic interactions. So there is a host which can sometimes live alone in green, and it can also be colonized by symbionts, which are at the beginning of the simulation parasitic. So in that case here, so the symbionts are harmful to the host, and the host does not provide voluntarily anything to the symbiont. But then we consider the appearance of novel phenotypes, mutualistic hosts, and mutualistic symbionts. So in red here, a mutualistic host is with a mutualistic symbiont, and there's also another trait which is evolving in that system. It's dispersal ability. So at the beginning of the simulation, the organisms disperse in the whole landscape. And during the evolution of mutualistic interaction, they can possibly evolve towards localized dispersal. And this is what happens for mutualistic pairs. Mutualistic pairs evolve towards localized dispersal so that they begin to form clusters, mutualistic clusters. And on the contrary, parasitic phenotypes keep the global dispersal strategy. So there's a phenotypic association. Parasites disperse globally and mutualists disperse locally. And due to the coevolution between dispersal ability and mutualistic effort, well, the system is partly invaded by mutualism. Not totally. Both types of phenotypes continue to coexist, but at least the mutualistic interaction emerges from a system which was initially entirely parasitic. Yeah?
Maybe you said it, but what are the x and y scales?
Just scale, space. Sorry.
Space, okay.
Yeah, I forgot that. So at that time it's a 2-dimensional state. I think it was necessary for the emergence of mutualism. I mean, one dimension was not enough.
Yeah, because you can't jump in one dimension.
Probably. I don't remember why. And it produces nice features. And so in that case, the selection operates at the level of the 2 species pair. So at the level of this small community, of the mutualistic community. So in that case, it's not just group selection, because group selection concerns a single species, it's community level selection. Okay, so first conclusion concerning ecological functions. So as we could see, there are many preconceptions about functions. And I think that a proper understanding and modeling of ecological functions require, at first, this conceptual clarification. So we have seen that there are, in fact, two research programs. Let's say a mainstream research program focusing on causal ecological functions, so either use or service functions, as we have seen. So in that case, ecological functions are byproducts of traits which have evolved at the species level, but not for the sake of the whole ecosystem. Okay. And there's another research program which I have mentioned concerning the evolution of tannin production, of mutualistic interactions, and so on, which tries to discover a design or evolved ecological function. And they are distinct, but I think that a fantastic challenge would be to try to articulate both research programs. How species level byproducts can become, in a later stage, the target of ecosystem level selection. Okay, then let's turn to the overall conclusions. So careful with metaphors. Can paintings be said to lie? That's from the Nuremberg Chronicle, les Chroniques de Nuremberg, so a very ancient manuscript. In this manuscript, it's a kind of atlas of different cities in Western Europe and also in the Mediterranean area. And so they present drawings on wood of a lot of different cities. So that's the one for Damascus. And in the same book, that's quite funny because they use exactly the same drawing for Mantua. So Damascus is in Syria, okay, and Mantua is a town in the middle of northern Italy, Mantova. Okay, so there's an error somewhere, but is it due to the painting or is it due to the interpretation of the painting? It depends on the interpretation we give to the painting. So if both of these interpretations are false, obviously. In fact, the drawing was inspired by another city, which is Nuremberg, precisely. But if the title had been the artist's concept of what a city looks like, then in that case, the interpretation is correct. So that's just one way to illustrate that in themselves, models cannot be false. Never, because they are just models. The error comes from the interpretation of the models. So this is what I've just said. And then, that's funny because we didn't communicate with Mathieu, but we reached exactly the same conclusion. Metaphors are needed to give sense to the models, and this is where we may encounter problems. So during the conception of the model, at several stages during the conception, so for instance, if we want to model an ecological function, should we build an eco-evolutionary model to model a design function, or should we build a purely ecological model in order to model a function which is a service or use function but not design? So that's a choice we have to make, and we need to be aware of the different preconceptions about the word function in order to be able to make this choice. Otherwise, we just choose at random if we are not aware of that. Or we don't choose at all, and then the model becomes obscured.
That's machine learning.
Huh?
Then it's machine learning.
So metaphors are also needed during the analysis of the model. Mais j'ai pas fait la bonne animation. So should we focus our analysis on equilibrium or on transient dynamics? So for instance, if we are absolutely willing to find some kind of balance of nature, then we will lean towards working on equilibrium. But maybe that's not the right thing to do. I don't know. Well, it depends on the ecological questions, obviously. And then also during the interpretation of the models, so should we, for instance, should we associate a positive value, I mean value in terms of what we think is good or bad, to a positive population equilibrium, or should we remain agnostic about the value of the equilibrium? Okay, so and here is Leontine's quote again to finish. That's it. Thank you.
I would like to, concerning your points about should we focus our analysis on equilibrium or transient dynamics, I have a completely out of left field example that I'm funny, which is in economics there are many models trying to explain the distribution of wealth and how wealthy or poor are people. And many of those models are trying to find the empirical distributions as their equilibrium solution. Because the assumption is the current distribution of wealth, rich and poor people, is how things are and how they should be stably, right? And in fact, there are a few models that actually fit a lot of distributions empirical, but not as their equilibrium, but as steps on the way to a single person having all the money. And I think it's an interesting difference in interpretation between the two things.
So is your break and that for
Yeah, just some questions.
your questions?
Yeah. Feel free to discuss. Just go quickly.
Okay. Thank you.